My name is Frank Peterson. I'm 63 years old, and for the last 40 of those years, I've lived on the same 100-acre patch of land tucked into the folds of the Appalachian foothills. I'm not a hermit, but I like my privacy. I worked for 25 years as a veterinary technician, mostly with large animals, before I retired to work this land full-time. I've helped birth calves in the middle of a blizzard. I've stitched up a horse that ran through a barbed wire fence, and I've put down more good dogs than I care to remember. I tell you this so you understand I'm not a man given to flights of fancy. I know bone and blood and muscle. I know the difference between a sick animal and a dangerous one. I've seen what nature can do, both beautiful and brutal, and I've never once seen anything that made me question the basic rules of the world. Until that night in late October, 9 years ago. I'm telling this story now because my wife, Martha, passed on last spring, and the quiet in this house has gotten too loud. The memory of that night fills up the empty spaces, and I figure if I put it out into the world, maybe it'll get a little smaller inside my own head. I know how it's going to sound. I've played it over 1,000 times, and even I have trouble believing it. But it happened. Every word of it. Before I get into what happened, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I share stories like this regularly. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I always like to know who's listening. All right, let me tell you what happened that fall. The leaves had already turned and mostly fallen, carpeting the woods in a layer of rust and gold that was starting to go brown and damp. We were in for a storm. You could feel it in the air, that heavy, wet pressure that makes your joints ache. The sky had been the color of a bad bruise all afternoon, and the wind was starting to pick up, making the old pines around the house sigh and creak like a ship's rigging. My dog, a blue heeler mix named Buster, had been acting strange all day. Normally, that dog was velcroed to my leg, but he'd been sticking close to the porch, whining low in his throat and staring out at the tree line with his hackles half raised. I'd chalked it up to the coming weather. Animals know, you know. They feel the pressure change long before we do. Around 9 o'clock, after Martha had gone to bed, I decided to do one last check on the animals before turning in myself. It was a routine I'd followed for decades. Put on my boots and my old canvas work coat, grab the big mag light from the hook by the door, and do a circuit. Chickens, the 2 goats, make sure the barn door was latched tight against the wind. When I opened the back door, the wind hit me with a spray of cold rain. It wasn't pouring yet, just spitting. Buster, who usually shot out the door ahead of me to sniff around, just flattened himself against the doorframe and refused to budge. I nudged him with my foot. "Come on, boy, let's go." He just whined again, a high, thin sound that wasn't like him at all. That was the first real flag, not just storm nerves. That was fear. I left him there and stepped out into the dark, pulling the door shut behind me. The world outside the small circle of my porch light was absolute black. The moon and stars were smothered by that thick blanket of cloud. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the first fat drops of rain splatting on the tin roof of the shed. It was the kind of night where you feel like you're the only person for 100 miles. I started my walk, the beam of the mag light cutting a clean, white tunnel through the darkness. The chicken coop was first. I shone the light inside. They were all there on their roosts, but they were dead silent. Chickens are never silent. They're always making some kind of soft clucking or rustling sound, even at night. But they were like feathered statues, their heads tucked, not a peep. It was unnatural. The silence itself felt loud, if that makes any sense. It was a held breath kind of quiet, the kind that comes right before a hawk stoops or a coyote makes its move. I latched the coop door, my unease growing, turning from a little tickle at the back of my neck to a cold knot in my stomach. My boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the barn. The barn is the oldest structure on the property, built from massive oak beams over a century ago. It's a sturdy, two-story affair with a big hayloft up top. It smells of hay and dust and animal manure, a comforting, earthy smell that I've known my whole life. But as I got closer, another smell hit me, carried on the damp wind. It cut right through the familiar scents. It was coppery, like fresh blood. And underneath that was something else. A heavy, musky odor, like a wet dog, but wilder, gamier. It was the smell of a predator. My first thought was a bear. We get them occasionally, usually just passing through. Or maybe a coyote had gotten bold and snagged one of the barn cats. I gripped the heavy aluminum flashlight a little tighter. It weighed a good 5 pounds. I'd used it to persuade more than one raccoon to leave my garbage cans alone. I reached the big sliding door of the barn. It was closed but not latched. I always latched it. I was meticulous about it. I slid the heavy door open just enough to slip inside, the wooden wheels groaning on the metal track. The air inside was thick with that smell, stronger now, almost suffocating. Blood, wet fur, and something else. Something that smelled like sickness, like infection. I stood just inside the doorway, listening. The rain was drumming on the metal roof now, a steady, rhythmic roar that muffled any other sound. I swept the beam of the mag light across the main floor. The goat pen was on the left. The two of them, Daisy and Pearl, were huddled in the far corner, pressed together so tight they looked like one animal. Their eyes were wide, reflecting my light back as big, white circles of terror. They were staring, not at me, but past me, toward the back of the barn. I followed their gaze with my light. The beam landed on the ladder that led up to the hayloft, and at the bottom of the ladder, I saw a dark, wet patch on the dirt floor. It was fresh. I took a few steps closer, my boots silent in the soft dirt. It was blood, a lot of it. A trail of it led from the base of the ladder and disappeared into the shadows of a stack of old hay bales in the corner. My heart started hammering against my ribs. My vet tech brain was clicking through possibilities. A deer, wounded by a hunter, had sought shelter and died. A bear, gored by another bear in a territorial dispute. My practical mind was desperately trying to find a normal box to put this in. But the smell, the silence of the chickens, Buster's fear, it all added up to something that didn't fit in any box I had. I took a deep breath, the foul air catching in my throat, and I moved toward the hay bales. I told myself I was a fool, that I should go back to the house, get my shotgun, and wait until morning. But I couldn't. It was the same instinct that made me run toward a distressed calf, not away from it. Something was hurt in my barn, and I had to know what it was. I kept the light trained on the shadows, my thumb on the switch, my knuckles white. The blood trail ended right where the hay bales met the wall. I crept forward, one slow step at a time until I could peer around the edge of the stack. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The beam of the mag light illuminated a shape, a heap of dark, matted fur slumped against the rough-hewn wooden wall. My initial thought, the one my mind desperately clung to, was that it was a man in a costume. A very, very elaborate and sick joke. Maybe some kids on drugs. But that didn't make sense. Who would come all the way out here? The shape was huge, far bigger than any man I knew. It was hunched over, its head down, so I couldn't see its face. One long, powerfully muscled arm was draped across its knees, and the other was pressed tight against its side. It was from that side that the blood was coming, soaking the dark fur and pooling on the ground beneath it. I could hear its breathing now, a ragged,
hitching sound, shallow and full of pain. It wasn't a man. The proportions were all wrong. The length of the limbs, the breadth of the shoulders. My next thought was bear. A big black bear, sick or injured. That made more sense. A wounded bear was incredibly dangerous. I started to back away slowly, trying not to make a sound. But as I moved, my boot scraped against a loose stone on the floor. The sound was tiny, almost lost in the drumming of the rain, but the creature heard it.
Its head snapped up. And that's when my world broke. The beam of my flashlight hit its face, and every rational explanation I had evaporated like mist in the sun. It was not a bear. It was canine. The head was shaped like that of a wolf or a German shepherd, with a long, powerful snout lined with teeth that I could see even with its mouth closed. The teeth were yellow, and the canines were long, like daggers. But the eyes, dear God, the eyes, they weren't the simple, reflective discs of an animal caught in a light. They were set forward in the skull, not on the sides, and they were intelligent. They glowed a faint, sickly yellow-green in the beam, but behind that glow, there was a mind, a terrified, pain-filled, but undeniably conscious mind. It stared at me, not with the blind panic of a cornered animal, but with a weary, calculating awareness. It tracked my movement. It saw the flashlight. It saw me, and it knew I was a threat. The ears were pointed and tall, like a shepherd's, and they twitched independently, tracking the sounds of the storm outside and my own ragged breathing inside. The fur was thick and black, matted with mud and blood, and as my light traveled down its body, I saw its hand. I can't call it a paw. It was lying palm up on its knee, and it had 5 long, articulated digits, just like a human hand, but they were covered in coarse black fur and tipped with thick, yellowed claws that looked like they could tear through sheet metal. It was a perfect, horrific fusion of man and wolf, and it was bleeding to death in my barn. I was frozen. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of that barn, lock the door, and never look back. This thing was a nightmare given flesh. It was something that shouldn't exist, something that broke all the rules of biology I had spent my life learning. My mind was scrambling, trying to file it away. A bear with mange? Some kind of genetic mutation? But no part of my logical brain could make this fit. It was too specific, too deliberate in its form. It was a predator, built for power and speed. And yet here it was, slumped and broken. The smell of its blood was thick in my throat. I could see the wound now, a deep, ragged gash running along its right side, from just below its armpit down its ribs. It looked like it had been sliced with something huge and sharp. The flesh was torn open, and I could see the pale glint of rib bone underneath. It was a mortal wound if it wasn't treated. As I stood there, locked in this silent standoff, the creature tried to shift its weight, and a low sound rumbled in its chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression. I've heard thousands of those. This was a groan of pure, unadulterated agony. Its whole body tensed, and its lips pulled back from its teeth in a silent snarl of pain. In that moment, something shifted in me. The terror was still there, a cold, vibrating hum in my bones. But 25 years of instinct kicked in. I wasn't looking at a monster anymore. I was looking at a patient, an animal in shock, bleeding out, suffering, and I knew how to fix it. The thought was insane, utterly, suicidally insane. Help it. This thing, this creature from a fever dream, it could kill me in a second, even as wounded as it was. One swipe of those claws would open me up from sternum to navel. But I couldn't just stand there and watch it die. It felt wrong. It felt like a failure of my most basic principles.
You don't let a living thing suffer if you can help it. That's what I'd built my life on. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands, my vet tech hands, were steady. I made a decision. A decision I still can't fully explain. I slowly, very slowly, lowered the flashlight so the beam was pointing at the ground between us, not directly in its eyes, a sign of non-aggression. I held up my empty left hand, palm open. "Easy," I whispered.
The word was barely a puff of air. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Its yellow eyes stayed locked on me, unblinking. It didn't relax, but it didn't tense up either. It just watched, its shallow breaths fogging slightly in the cold, damp air. "I need to go get my kit," I said, still whispering. "I'm going to help you. I'm just going to the house. I'll be right back." I don't know why I was talking to it. Maybe I was just talking to myself, trying to calm my own shredded nerves. I started backing away, one deliberate shuffling step at a time, never taking my eyes off it. It watched me go, its head following my movement until I was back at the barn door. I slipped outside, slid the door shut, and leaned against it, my legs suddenly feeling like jelly. The cold rain on my face felt real, grounding. I just stood there for a full minute, gasping for air. The image of those intelligent, pain-filled eyes burned into my mind. Then I turned and ran to the house. Buster was waiting at the door, a frantic, whining mess. I ignored him, heading straight for the mudroom where I kept my old large animal vet kit. It was a big metal case filled with everything from sutures and antiseptics to heavy-duty tranquilizers. I grabbed the kit, and then I stopped. My shotgun was in the gun cabinet right next to it. The responsible, sane part of my brain was screaming at me to take it. Go back in there with the 12 gauge, not a needle and thread. But I couldn't. Bringing the gun would change the dynamic. It would make my intention clear. I was a threat. If I was going to do this, I had to go in as a medic, not a hunter. It was a stupid romantic notion, but it was the only way I could make this make sense in my head. I grabbed a couple of old, clean towels and a bucket, which I filled with warm water from the tap. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline starting to wear off and leave me with a deep systemic tremor. What in God's name am I doing? The question echoed in my skull. I was walking back into a barn to perform surgery on a creature that folklore and horror movies had warned me about my entire life. I walked back out into the storm, the heavy kit banging against my leg. The rain was coming down harder now, a solid, driving sheet of water that soaked my coat in seconds. The walk back to the barn felt like a mile. Every rustle of the wind in the trees sounded like something stalking me. By the time I reached the door, I was drenched and shaking, half from cold, half from sheer terror. I took a deep breath, slid the door open again, and stepped back inside. It hadn't moved. It was still slumped in the corner, a dark mass of misery. The beam of my flashlight found it, and those same yellow eyes found me. I set the vet kit and the bucket of water down about 10 feet away from it, moving slowly, deliberately. I laid the towels out on a clean patch of hay. I tried to keep my movements small and predictable, the way you do around a spooked horse. I opened the kit. The metallic click of the latches was unnaturally loud in the barn. I took out what I would need: a sterile flush syringe, iodine solution, forceps, suture needles, and a spool of absorbable gut suture. I laid them out on one of the clean towels. All the while, I kept talking to it in a low, calm monologue. "It's okay. This is just to clean you up. It's gonna sting a little, but it'll help. You've lost a lot of blood. We gotta get this closed up." Its eyes never left me. It watched me prepare everything with that unnerving intelligence. It was like it understood.
The moment of truth came. I had to get closer. I had to touch it. I filled the syringe with warm water and added a splash of iodine, turning the water the color of weak tea. I picked it up along with a towel, and I started to approach.
I didn't walk, I shuffled, staying low to the ground to make myself seem smaller, less threatening. 1 foot in front of the other. The 10 feet between us felt like a chasm. 5 feet. I could smell it more strongly now, the blood and the wet animal musk. 3 feet. I could see the rise and fall of its chest, the way the fur was clumped and sticky around the wound. I was close enough to touch it. I stopped, crouched down, and just stayed there for a moment, letting it get used to my presence. It tensed, a low rumble starting in its chest again. It was a warning. "I know," I whispered. "I know. I'm sorry." I reached out slowly, my hand trembling, not with the syringe, but just my empty hand. I extended it toward its uninjured shoulder. This was the point of no return. If it was going to attack, this was when it would happen. My hand touched its fur. The fur was coarse and thick, like a wolf's, but underneath it, the body was hard with muscle and burning with feverish heat. The creature flinched violently at my touch, but didn't strike. The rumbling in its chest deepened, but it held still. I took that as permission. Slowly, carefully, I began to clean the wound. I flushed it with the warm iodine water, washing away the dirt and hay and clotted blood. The gash was even worse than I'd thought. It was deep, at least 4 inches, and long. Whatever had done this had meant to kill it. The creature shuddered with every touch, its breathing hitching, but it remained passive. It seemed to understand, on some level, that I was trying to help. There was a moment, as I was cleaning near the edge of the wound, that my fingers brushed against its skin. It wasn't leathery like a dog's. It was pliable and warm, unnervingly like human skin, just underneath the thick pelt. I worked as quickly as I could, my years of training taking over. My fear was still there, a constant, high-pitched ringing in my ears, but I walled it off, focusing on the task at hand. Flush, debride, prepare for sutures. I threaded the curved needle. This was going to be the worst part. Stitching flesh is painful, and I had no anesthetic to give it. "I'm sorry about this," I said softly. "This is going to hurt." I took a breath and made the first stitch. The creature's body went rigid. A sharp, guttural cry, half snarl, half scream, was torn from its throat, and its head thrashed back against the wall. Its clawed hand shot out, not at me, but to the side, and its claws gouged deep furrows into the thick oak planking of the barn wall. The sound of splintering wood was deafening. But it hadn't attacked me. It had consciously directed its agony away from me. I froze, my heart in my throat, the needle still in its flesh. Its head slowly turned back, and its yellow eyes bored into mine. There was fury in them, and agony, but also something else. A flicker of gratitude? I don't know. I just knew I had to finish. I worked steadily after that, pulling the ragged edges of the wound together, stitch by painful stitch. The creature lay there, shuddering, its breathing harsh, but it didn't make another sound. It just endured. I tied off the last suture, my hands slick with a mixture of blood and iodine and sweat. The wound was closed. It was a messy, ugly piece of work, but it would hold. It would give the thing a chance. I sat back on my heels, completely drained. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its place. The creature's head was slumped forward again, its breathing still shallow but more regular now. I thought it had passed out from the pain and blood loss.
I started to gather my tools, my movements slow and clumsy. I was just about to stand up and leave it to its fate when it stirred. Its massive head lifted again, and it looked directly at me. Its eyes were clearer now, the fog of pain having receded slightly. It focused on my face, and I felt pinned by its gaze. It was a look of immense age and weariness. Then its lips, and they were lips, thin and black and disturbingly flexible, peeled back from its teeth. I braced myself, thinking it was a snarl, but no sound came out. It took a ragged breath, a whistling sound from its injured chest. Its jaw moved, and for a second I thought it was just a spasm. Then it spoke. It wasn't a voice like you or I have. It was a sound scraped raw from the bottom of its throat, a guttural whisper that was more vibration than sound, thick with pain and the anatomy of a mouth not made for human words. It was only 4 words, but they landed in my brain like shards of glass. They're not what you think. And that was it. Its eyes rolled back in its head, and its whole body went limp, its head slumping onto its chest. It had finally passed out.
I just knelt there in the dirt and blood and hay, the rain hammering on the roof, and those 4 whispered words echoing in the sudden silence of the barn. They're not what you think. Who was they? What wasn't what I thought? The questions crashed over me, a wave of confusion and a new, deeper kind of fear. The terror I'd felt before was simple, primal, the fear of being killed and eaten by a monster. This was different. This was a cold, intellectual dread. This creature, this monster, wasn't the ultimate nightmare. It was a messenger. It was a victim. It was running from something else. I don't know how long I stayed there, crouched on the floor. It could have been minutes or an hour. Eventually, the cold started to seep into my bones, and I managed to get my legs to work. I gathered up my bloody tools and the soiled towels, moving like an old man. I took one last look at the creature, a huge, dark shape breathing shallowly in the corner of my barn. My work was done. I couldn't do any more for it. I backed out of the barn, slid the heavy door closed, and this time I dropped the latch. I stood outside in the pouring rain, the water washing the blood from my hands, and I stared at the dark, silent building. My sanctuary, my workspace, was now a monster's recovery room. I went back to the house, stripped off my wet, bloody clothes on the back porch, and went inside. Buster was still by the door, and he sniffed at me, whining, smelling the blood and the fear and the alien scent of the creature on me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark living room in my armchair, my 12-gauge shotgun resting across my lap. I just sat there, watching the barn through the window, waiting for the sun to rise. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept hearing that voice in my head, that rasping, impossible whisper. They're not what you think. When the first gray light of dawn finally started to filter through the clouds, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know. I pulled on my boots, grabbed the shotgun, and walked back out to the barn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, washed world. The air was cold and crisp. I slid the barn door open, my heart pounding. The barn was empty. It was gone. For a wild second, I thought I might have dreamed the whole thing, a stress-induced hallucination. But the evidence was there. The dark, sticky patch of blood on the dirt floor, though it had been scuffed over with hay. The deep, vicious gouges in the oak wall where its claws had torn into the wood. And on the floor, next to the bloodstain, was my suture kit. I had left it on a hay bale. It was now sitting neatly on the floor, wiped clean of blood. Next to it lay the used, bloody suture needles, arranged in a perfectly straight line. It was a thank you,
A deliberate, intelligent act.
I stood there in the quiet of my barn for a long time, the shotgun feeling heavy and useless in my hands. I knew then that I could never tell anyone. Who would believe me? They'd lock me up. I spent the next hour meticulously cleaning up. I shoveled the bloody dirt and hay into a bucket and buried it deep in the woods. I scrubbed the floor. I took the splintered piece of the wall and burned it in the wood stove. I washed my vet kit until it gleamed, sterilizing every instrument twice. By the time Martha woke up, there was no trace. No evidence that anything had ever happened, except for the memory branded into my mind. Life went on. The seasons changed. But something inside me had been fundamentally broken and rearranged. The woods I had known and loved my whole life were no longer a place of peace. They were a veil. I found myself watching the tree line constantly, searching for movement. I'd be mending a fence and the snap of a twig would make me drop my tools and spin around, my heart racing. I started carrying a heavy pistol on my hip whenever I was outside, something I'd never done before. Martha noticed the change in me, of course. She said I was jumpy, that I had a darkness in my eyes that wasn't there before. I just blamed it on getting older. But the question haunted me day and night. They're not what you think. I spent hours on the internet, late at night when Martha was asleep, going down rabbit holes I never knew existed. I read about Bigfoot, about aliens, about all the strange things people claim to see in the woods. I read the stories about Dogmen. Most of it was sensationalist garbage, but some of the witness accounts described the same creature I had seen, right down to the intelligent eyes and the eerily human-like hands. They were always described as aggressive, malevolent. But the thing in my barn hadn't been malevolent. It had been wounded, desperate, and rational. It chose not to kill me when it had every reason and opportunity to do so. And it had warned me. But who were they? If a 7-foot-tall wolf man was scared of them, what in God's name were they? Were they the reason it was hurt? Were they some other kind of creature? Or was it talking about something else entirely? Was it talking about us? People? Was it trying to tell me that the real monsters weren't the ones with claws and fangs? I've never found an answer. It's been 9 years, and I've never seen it again. I've never found any strange tracks or heard any unusual sounds. It's like it vanished from the face of the earth. But I know it's out there. And I know whatever it was running from is out there too. I'm telling this story because I'm an old man now, and I don't want to take this to my grave. Maybe someone else out there has seen something similar. Maybe someone has heard the same warning. I don't go into the woods after dark anymore. I keep my doors locked, and I trust my dog's instincts above all else. The world is not as simple as we think it is. The maps we've drawn have vast, empty spaces, and there are things living in those spaces that we don't have names for. We live in our own little well-lit barns, thinking we're safe, but there are things moving in the dark, just outside the door, that are older and stranger than we can possibly imagine. The thing in my barn wasn't the monster. I'm sure of that now. It was just another creature, caught in a struggle I can't comprehend. The real horror of that night wasn't seeing a monster. It was realizing that the monster was afraid of something else. And I have no idea what that something is. That's what keeps me awake at night, all these years later. Not the memory of those yellow eyes, or the feel of its coarse fur under my hands. It's the echo of that impossible,
dying whisper. They're not what you think.